Alright, so in this video, we're going to talk about the delayed c-bet, and what we're going to do, just like we did in the last videos, we're going to start with our PowerPoint presentation, and then we're going to end the video with some hand history reviews, specifically 4 different hands that I pulled from my Poker Tracker 4 database. So what is a delayed c-bet? Again, I know a lot of you already know what it is, but let's go ahead and define it. So if we decide not to c-bet on the flop, so let's say we're the pre-flop raiser, we go to the flop and we decide to check back the flop and not c-bet it, and then either c-bet the turn or the river, this is considered a delayed c-bet, because what we're doing here is we are delaying our c-bet 1 or 2 streets. So we're either checking back the flop in the turn, or we're checking the flop then betting the turn, or we're checking the flop, checking the turn, then betting the river. Now, there are 3 specific reasons for employing a delayed c-betting strategy, and that's what I want to really discuss in this video, and that's what these hand history reviews are really going to focus in on. So those 3 different reasons are: number 1, to slow play our hand and to induce our opponents to bet with worse hands; to pot control with a hand that really isn't strong enough to c-bet; and then to bluff with a hand that doesn't have great showdown value. So let's go ahead and let's talk about these 3 individually. So when would we look to slow play / induce our opponent? So we can utilize a slow playing strategy when we have a monster hand that has the board crushed, where it's very unlikely that our opponent has a hand that's strong enough to call a value bet. And this one's fairly straightforward, and so I didn't put together example hands to talk about this one, but when we think about this, let's say that we end up flopping a full house, or we end up flopping top set on a really dry board, or we end up flopping the nut straight on a really dry board. And it's very hard for our opponent to actually have a hand that's strong enough to call a value bet. These are situations in which we'd want to slow play our hand, because if we think about getting back to the reasons to bet, remember, value betting is when we expect our opponents to call a decent amount of the time with weaker hands. Well, if we don't think they're going to be able to call, then we should slow play our hand instead, because the expected value of slow playing is going to be higher than the expected value of c-betting that flop. So again, when we do this, there's a couple of benefits to that. Number 1, when we sometimes check these really strong hands, we underrepresent the strength of our hand. So yes, we know that we have the board crush. We know that we have a full house, we have quads, we have the nut flush, we have the nut straight. We have a very strong hand, but when we check back in our opponent's eyes, we underrepresent the strength of our hand. So they may think that we don't have a strong hand, and they're thinking, well, you know what? My opponent may have missed his flop with their range, and that might actually induce our opponents to bluff. So that's the first benefit of slow playing. We're inducing our opponents to bet as a bluff, or to bet with worse hands that they think is the best hand. The second thing is that if we check back and our opponent checks back, we allow them the opportunity to improve their hand. So let's say that they have ace high and an ace hits the turn, but we still have the board crushed. Well, guess what? They just improved their hand, or we allowed them to improve to a lower flush, or we allowed them to improve to a lower boat. We allowed them to improve to 2 pair or a set. All these different types of hands that we still beat. Well, then we get value from them because their hand has improved, and they may lead out on the turn or the river, and they may potentially call a delayed c-bet as well. So those are the benefits to slow playing a hand, and I think this one is fairly straightforward and basic. Now let's talk about the second reason. The second reason is for pot control. So when would we want to use a pot control type of a strategy? Well, it's when we have a weaker value hand that really isn't strong enough to bet for value. So we're talking about our medium strength hands. So top pair with a weak kicker, middle pair, hands that are decent, but they're not really strong, thick value, strong hands, right? They are more on the thinner side of the value. So it's a weaker hand, it's a medium strength hand, but we don't think it's strong enough to c-bet the flop. But sometimes we're going to have the best hand, and more often than not, we're going to have the best hand. With these types of hands, with these medium strength hands, we utilize a pot control because we want to minimize the size of the pot, right? We want the size of the pot to be limited, and we want to try to get to showdown with these hands. So our goal with these hands is to get to showdown, meaning we go to the river and show down our hands to see who had the best one, because we don't get a lot of benefit from these hands by betting. Now, when we're talking about pot control, let's say that we check the flop and we check the turn and our opponent checks back every time. If we think they're going to call with a very weak hand, we can look to extract very thin value with these hands on the river, and even sometimes on the turn if our opponent is really bad and we know that they call too often, and a hand that we check the flop now becomes a hand that we can value bet thinly on the turn in the river versus a very poor loose calling station. So that's something we can also do as well. Now, the third reason is just as a bluff. So we're talking about our weakest hands here. So when we have a very weak hand that isn't a semi-bluffing hand, that doesn't have the possibility of improving on the turn, and we completely whiffed out on a flop, this is a hand that we can use as a bluffing hand when our showdown value is terrible. So with our weakest hands, we can delay c-bet either on the turn or the river as a bluff rather than checking back, because we don't want to show down our hand, because we think if we get to showdown we're going to lose. So when would we want to do this? Well, typically if we're checking and our opponents are checking twice, that's a good sign that they don't really have that strong of a hand. So checking back twice is generally a sign of weakness at the micro stakes, and we can exploit that with a hand that really doesn't have that great of showdown value by bluffing in the correct situations against opponents that are going to fold. Now, against a calling station, this isn't going to work, but against somebody that plays more fit or fold, and we think that they are on the needier side, then we can utilize this type of a strategy. So those are the three different reasons. So with the delayed c-bet, we can delay c-bet to slow play / induce our opponents to bluff. We can slow play to pot control our medium strength hands, and we can slow play to potentially look to bluff on later streets with our weakest hands. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at some example hands. Again, I focus more so on our weaker hands and our hands that we can look to potentially bluff more so than on our strongest hands, just because I think those ones are fairly straightforward and everybody gets that. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at the first hand. So we have ace-2 suit offsuit on the button, and with ace-2's offsuit, of course, this is going to be within our ceiling raise. So we open raise on the button as a steal attempt. We get a fold from small blind and big blind calls. We go to the flop. The flop is not the greatest flop for us, right? It is a semi-wet board texture with flush draws and straight draws, and we have nothing more than bottom pair with no backdoor draws other than a runner straight draw. So big blind checks, we decide to check back. The turn is a 3. We get a little bit of equity here because we can improve to a straight with a 4. But the problem with that as well is that if a 4 hits here, our opponent is going to have a lot of 6x hands in their range. So there's going to be, ace-6, 6-7, 6-8, 6-5, a lot of 6s in their hand within their range that they're going to defend in the big blind. So it's not the best card for us. So our opponent checks again, and then on the turn we bet just over around a half pot size bet for thin value here, and also to protect our hand. Now, this is almost to the point where this is a bit of a bluff, just because it really isn't a semi-bluff, because even when we do hit the 4, we're going to lose a decent amount of the time. So we are betting here more so as a bluff and a very thin value here as well with our pair of 2s to protect our equity and our opponent folds. So that's our first example. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at our second example. So again, a lot of weaker hands, and I'm doing this to show you some of the pot control and the bluffing here. So we have Jack-6 suited. Again, we open raise on the button as a steal attempt. Again, this may not be within everybody's button open raising range, but it's in mine if I think the conditions are right. So our opponent's call, our hand is a middling strength hand, right? This is one of those pot control hands. We have pair of 6s here. So we have 2 opponents, small blind checks, big blind checks. We check back with our middling strength hand here, our pair of 6s with no flush draw for us, no straight draw for us, just middle pair with a so-so kicker. Small blind checks back again. big blind checks, actions on us on the button, and then we fire out a delayed c-bet with our medium strength hand for, again, a combination of protection and a combination of thin value here. So this is a pot control hand, but things get a bit precarious on the turn here, because not only is there a flush draw, but now there is another straight draw to go with the lower end straight draw with the 3-6. So now we have the queen 10 with a higher end straight draw. So we get value here from betting this turn because our opponents have checked back twice and our hand is very vulnerable to a lot of river cards. So a 4, a 5, a 7, a club, any Broadway card as well is not going to be great for us. Even a jack, because that's going to improve a lot of straights even though it gives us 2 pair. So they both fold and we take down the pot. All right, let's move on to our third hand. We have 8-7 offsuit on the button, open raise, and we get a call from the big blind. We go to the flop. We completely whiff out on this flop. So our opponent checks. We decide to check back with 8-7 offsuit. Again, this is going to be some of our weakest hands. Typically, these are hands that we're going to be check folding. So for those of you that watched the previous course I created before this one, our post-flop fundamentals courses, we broke hands down into the different categories. So we have our hands that we typically bet, which are our strongest hands and our drawing hands, and then hands that we look to check are our medium strength hands and our weakest hands. So again, this is typically a hand that we're going to look to check fold, but in the correct situation, we can look to bluff when we don't have showdown value. So our opponent checks twice, the action's on us. We fire out a delayed c-bet on the turn with nothing but complete air. So we have 8 high here, but our opponent has checked twice. It's very unlikely they have an ace. It's very unlikely they have a king. And this was actually a play that we potentially would make with a pair of kings as well, that our opponent would assume we would do, because we wouldn't want to c-bet the flop with a king all that often. Sometimes we're going to check back and then delayed c-bet the turn. So when we bet this turn, we're sometimes going to have an ace, sometimes going to have a king, and our opponent is going to fold a lot. So this is an example of a pure bluff with a hand that doesn't have any showdown value. We don't want to get to the river, and we don't want to show down 8 high. So that's an example of a bluff. Let's take a look at one more. So we have ace-deuce suited on the button. We get a call from small blind. Big blind folds. We go to the flop. We completely whiffed out on this flop. Our opponent checks. We check back. We go to the turn. On the turn, we do pick up a little bit of equity with our backdoor straight draw. Our opponent checks. We check back again. We go to the river. We whiff out on that as well. So we have ace high. Ace high has so showdown value, but we lose to pairs of 3s. We lose to pocket 4s up to pocket 6s. We lose to a pair of 7s. We lose for hands such as pocket 8s, pocket 9s, pocket 8s and pocket 9s. I was going to say pocket 10s, but of course that's not a hand that's going to be checking down. So all those weaker one pair of hands we lose to, which is quite a bit of what this opponent is going to be defending with and looking to get to showdown with. So what we do is we end up doing a delayed c-bet on the river as a bluff with ace high that we don't think has the greatest showdown value, and our opponent folds and we take down the pot. So that's going to conclude this lecture. Again, as you noticed, a majority of our hands we focused on bluff examples and we focused on pot control. I didn't really include anything to slow play and induce because, again, I think this one is straightforward. Everybody knows how to look to slow play their strongest hands, but not everybody knows how to employ a delayed c-betting strategy for pot control and as a bluff. So anyways, if you have any questions, please let me know. If not, thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.